When we bump up against the limitations of our own time, resources, or capacity, it's so easy to get overwhelmed when new opportunities present themselves. Should you take that new job, join the small group at your church, go on a date with that guy, maybe start volunteering at your kid's school? This is the GraceLaced podcast, and I'm Eve Stipes. Today, my co-host Ruth Jo Simons and I are sitting down to talk about what it means to know what you're called to do in your current season of life. Whether you're doing the dishes, going for a walk, listening in today as you drive to work, or sitting down with an afternoon cup of coffee, we're so glad you're here. So let's get to it.
Okay, so let's start by talking about what we mean by this word calling. What is calling? It feels so mysterious and almost intimidating, right? Sometimes especially like when you're in your early 20s or so I just remember feeling like, what is my calling? What
Right.
is my purpose in life? Why am I on this earth? And sometimes you can sit there for so long, like immovable, like scared to take a first step because you don't know what your calling is. So let's just demystify this a little bit and
Yeah.
say, I think a good definition would just be that it's a prayerful consideration of how God's wired you and created you and what he's made you passionate about in combination with what he's put right in front of you to do, what he's
Yeah.
given you to do. So it's not like some big mysterious, this is the only purpose you have in your
Right.
entire life. Because honestly, even let's not talk all about me this episode, but the truth is, I feel like I've lived multiple careers, multiple callings,
Yeah.
multiple seasons of my life. I've been a pastor's wife, been a headmaster's wife, same man. But I mean, I've church planted, I've started a school, I've started a business, I've mothered in hidden years.
Yeah.
Those were all callings, but they weren't all one calling, and I
Right.
didn't do all of them at the same time. So first and foremost, I would just say, um, let's all agree to our listeners listening in, like let's drop our shoulders a little bit. Let's not feel
Yeah.
so stressed out
Relax.
about figure out what your calling is, but to say, okay, I'm going to start by thinking, how has God wired me? What's the passion that he's
Yeah.
put on my heart? What are the interests and things that I'm wired to like be about? For example, Ruth Jo Simons is kind of creative and artsy, and I'm passionate about people and relationships and lots of beautiful and creative things. That's how I'm wired.
Yeah.
But he's put right in front of me at certain times a season of motherhood or a
Mm-hmm.
season of homeschooling or a season of starting a business. How I'm wired and how that plays out in each of those seasons is my calling in that season.
Yeah. Yeah. So like today we're really talking about, maybe we could phrase it this way, not like the big C calling over like what's the vision for your whole life, but kind of like our seasonal small C callings. Like what is it that we're doing right now and not getting too bogged down in like, oh, the weight of
Yeah.
I don't know, but just what's in front of me and how has God made me?
Okay, so Eve Stipes, what is your if somebody said, Eve, what's the calling that you're, no if somebody said, hey, do
Yeah.
you know your calling, Eve? What would you say it is right now?
I would say that it's primarily mothering, like that I have little kids. I have a 5-year-old and by the time you hear this, 3-year-old twins, which seems crazy to me. But yeah, so I have a
Amazing.
lot of
Yeah.
little people in my house. And right now, my primary calling is to like disciple and train their little hearts for righteousness. And so that is a full-time job in and of itself. But yeah, so that's my primary calling. And then I would say secondarily is like the work that I get to do with you
Mm,
for GraceLaced and for your writing and things like that. The way that we get to partner together for that is kind of my second biggest priority or calling for this season. And so because my family and children are the bigger thing for right now, I'm only working part-time, even
mhm.
though you and I have talked about it many times. We would love for me to
I'd
be
love you
full-time.
on for like 50 hours a week. Just kidding.
Right.
I would never do
That
that to
would
you, but
be
yeah.
wonderful. And we have plenty of work to do and it would be so much
Mhm,
fun. But because of knowing my own limitations and capacity
mhm.
and understanding like, okay, these kids and my family and taking care and of my husband and our house and all those things are my primary role and responsibility. So I'm only working part-time.
That's good. Okay, let me try and
Yeah, what
do
would
the
you say
same for
yours
me.
are?
So, because I think I'm going to try to process this out loud. I am a verbal processor, so this is
No,
helpful.
really? Are you really?
Oh my goodness. Except that this is going to feel raw because I'm doing this like live
Yes.
on this podcast. But okay, there are a lot I have lots of jobs,
Yeah,
right?
you
I have
do.
the jobs and calling are not the same thing. So I have
Right.
jobs like I need to lead a team. I write books.
Yeah.
I record a podcast. I speak at conferences.
Mhm.
Um, what else do I do? That's it. Just kidding.
That's
Um,
all.
but I have different jobs.
Yeah.
But my calling, when I think about what my calling is, I would sum it up as my number one calling is to disciple and to share the gospel and the beauty of Christ with all those God's placed in my life. So if
Mhm.
that's my calling, then my role as a mom who disciples her children,
Yeah.
currently that's 5 who are actively living at home, that is my number one calling, just like you're saying. Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that job is somehow like it doesn't mean that that's my only job. It just means
Right.
that that's my heart. Like my real
Yeah.
calling, what I know I'm called to do is to make sure that I am raising up the next generation in my home um in the knowledge of Christ
Mhm.
and then the love of their Savior. So that's my calling. But if that's my calling to disciple those around me, then that's also the heartbeat of why I lead GraceLaced team. So
Right.
it's a job to look at sales projections and it's a job to create products and market products and sell products and run a business.
Yeah.
But my calling isn't that the running a business is not my calling. My
Yeah.
calling is to use my gifts to do any of those things. So
Yeah.
I think when I think about it like that, even if I'm verbally processing out loud for the first time here, it helps me recognize that my calling isn't threatened when the ebb and flow of running a business is hard or easy, when we
Yeah.
have great increases or when we suffer some financial loss, when some product does really well or some product doesn't do really well.
Yeah.
My calling isn't fluctuating with that because that's an outworking, one of my jobs, but my calling is I'm going to disciple others through my gifts. And
Yeah.
so that comes out in my relationships with others and the work that I do. But I will say in terms of because we're going to get real practical here. But when I think
Yeah.
about what you're saying about how you're part time because your calling is at home, primarily with your children, I would say because my calling is to disciple those God's placed in front of me, that means that my children, my husband, my team, and my immediate community here in Western Colorado, these people really get the majority of my time.
Yeah.
Which means that I would love to say yes to every speaking engagement, every conference, every opportunity to do something cool and collaborate with somebody. I would love to do all of that. But I have
Yeah.
to say no, and I have to have metrics for what I say yes to
Yeah.
because I can't serve all the people out there on the internet or in live conferences. I can't do that all the time. I can't spend all my time on the internet if I'm going to respond to my calling immediately and close to home. And so
Yeah.
that's a limitation that's hard because I get a lot of, let's just be really honest. I didn't think I was going to say this out loud this way, but if I spend my time on the internet and I give away my discipleship primarily on social media, I could see a lot of results.
Mhm.
If you know that the algorithm would love me. If
Yeah.
I spent all my time creating content to disciple the internet,
Mhm.
I think that would,
It would get shared. It would get passed
yeah, it would be
on. It would be
great.
yeah.
But that wouldn't fulfill the ultimate calling of starting right where I am with the people God's given me. So that's a limitation that's hard for me to embrace sometimes because who doesn't love to see results? Who
Yeah.
doesn't love to see accolades and followers go up and all the things that come with being consistent and wonderfully creative on the internet? But I personally, right now, cannot do both things well. I can't
Yeah.
be present on the internet and be ever present with the people that God's already given me at the same time.
Yeah. And you touched a little bit on what we'll talk more about next week too, of like, this is kind of we're talking about two sides of the same coin, like knowing what you're called
Mhm.
to do. And the next week, we're going to talk about saying no with confidence. And so it's our yeses and our nos really matter, right? Like what we say yes to means we're saying no to something else. And all of those threads tie together, and they're not always neat and tidy. And so, yeah, that absolutely makes a difference. When I think about, like, where do we see this in the Bible, or like what's our example, or what are we drawing from? It may not be the very best example, but the first one that comes to mind is Moses and Jethro.
Mm.
So I don't know if you are familiar with the story. I'm actually going to read some of the verses. So this is in Exodus 18, and I'm going to read you like 10 verses. So hang in there, okay? So Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. He's come to like see what God is doing with Israel. So here's what it says in verse 13. The next day, Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father in law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Moses' father in law said, "What you're doing is not good." I just love that. "What you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You will represent the people before God and bring their cases to God, and you shall warn them about the statute and law and make them know the way they should go and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, hate a bribe. Place these men over the people as chiefs of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens." So basically, he's telling them, you need help. Like, what you're doing is not okay. You are not called to talk to every single Joe Schmo Israelite who is mad at their neighbor because they stole their cow. Like, it's not okay, Moses. Like, there are millions of people here. You cannot sit here day to night and just listen to people complain. That's not what God has called you to do. That's what Jethro is basically saying, right?
Mhm.
Like, this is too much. This is not good. So the suggestion for him is to find people to set up over smaller groups. They can kind of escalate problems as needed to Moses. He can still um, be the ultimate like call maker, the one who explains God's will to the people when they need it most. But not every single thing needs to come to them. And I just think, wow, like that is such a good example to me of know what you're called to do. Like he was not called to listen to Joe
Yeah.
Schmo. He was
Yeah.
called to take the really weighty things and to explain what God's people needed to know, but not necessarily be in the minutia.
Well, and I think we're going to touch on this some more next week too. But the truth is, when we spread ourselves too thin to do what we're not called to do, it actually limits our capacity and ability to do what
Yeah.
we're actually called to do. So Jethro's like, this is not good because you actually have to keep your real calling, your actual job in mind, not try to please everybody
Yeah.
and spread yourself so thin that you actually can't do what God's really called you to do. How about we ask some questions, because I feel like this is such a practical season
Yeah.
that maybe it's like, okay, so some of our questions for one another and for you as our listener is, if you've got a notebook, like I think it even is good to be like, grab your phone or grab a notebook and write
Yeah.
down, what am I really called to do? What are my passions and what
Yeah.
has God already given me to do?
Well, I think before you even start, one thing to think about is like, what are the things that God calls every believer to do and be part of on the day to day? Like, what is it that we're called to? We can think of some really big items like the Great Commission, right? Like, we're all supposed to be involved with discipling, taking the gospel like near and far, and making sure that people are coming into the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and like big things like we're called to holiness, for example. We're not
Right.
we're not going into all the big C things, we're
Yeah.
called to the Great Commission, to holiness, to actually being vessels for the gospel of Jesus. Like absolutely. But when we're talking about like how do I make a decision about whether I sit here all day and
Yeah.
listen to all these issues or whether I should do this next thing? I think on a very practical level, it's really about assessing our small c callings and what God's doing in our lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so even being able to name what season you're in might be a good place to start, like acknowledging like, "Yes, I, Eve Stipes, have a husband and 3 children that need to be somewhere in the mix of what's going on," right? Like, they need to be part of what's happening. So even that
Yeah.
maybe that's a good step, like
That
listing
we
out
just
like
don't, yeah, that we're
yeah,
not like just saying, "Hey, these are all separate things," and I can
right.
be 100% in every single lane and not recognize that our callings are interwoven together.
Yeah.
Well, for the sake of practicality, because you and I are real good about, because when you and I really have coffee together, we just go around and around and we talk about lots of things that
We
make a huge difference.
pontificate.
But I think that um, I'm hoping that our listener here is either like, driving somewhere on the go, but I'm hoping as you listen that you're feeling exactly what we're wrestling through. Just these questions of like, okay, so now how do I respond to this? So for the sake of practicality, why don't I just throw out a couple ideas that um if you've got your phone handy, maybe you pull out your notes app and jot it down. Maybe you grab your
Yeah.
journal. I think um and if it's a GraceLaced beautiful journal, brownie points
Even
to you.
better.
But whatever it is, or just grab the back of a receipt, even if you're in car line, just jot some things down. But I think Eve's suggestion first is a great one. Like, what is the season you're in? Acknowledge
Mm.
the actual season that you're in right now. Is it a season where somebody else is um, dependent on you and you have to really
Yeah.
give of your time to care for that person? Are you in a season of building and whatever it is that God's called you to do, that you're building, building, building? Are you in a season where you need to step back and reevaluate? There's
Yeah.
just lots of ways to talk about that season. Number two, I would say it would probably be really good to write out, how are you wired? Like, if we're
Mhm.
talking about this thing of calling, like, how has God wired you, made you passionate? What
Yeah.
things cause you to light up? I mean, Eve, you crack me up because you and Troy are the only two people I know who write in your actual bio line, sometimes your profiles, like eternally curious, or your most curious friend, or the most curious person. And it's actually true. You guys are similar in this
Yeah.
way where I will never be surprised if you're suddenly like, I want to learn a new language, or I'm going to pick up this thing that I've never done before. But now at this age, this is the thing I'm going to start new in my life. That's why you all are like incredibly smart. You've read a lot of things. You've really understood a big breadth of multiple disciplines.
Random things.
And
The
so
most random things.
right. But the truth is that's how you're wired. You're wired
Yeah.
to be a problem solver, to think through things, to philosophize. Is that the word? Philosophize about stuff. You're really wired to learn. And so I think that's
Mhm.
really important. So when you think about how are you wired for Ruth Joe Simons, it's that I am wired to be really relational, creative. I have to make things beautiful. I'm constantly thinking about how to make the connection between what God's created and what is true about what he says about us. That's just the way I'm wired, constantly looking at creation and looking at the beauty around me and trying to extrapolate and understand God's word through the things that he's made as well.
Yeah.
So
You're also very strategic, so you're always thinking about how
that's
to
true.
tweak things or make it a little bit
Yep.
better or
That's a good point.
change or leverage or steward it better. So,
Okay, I'll write that down too.
okay.
So we should really do this. And so as you jot down the way you're wired, and then number three, are we on number three?
Yeah.
Number three, write down, okay, so that might be how I'm wired and what I'm really like, the way I'm passionately drawn to things. And then number three would be, well, what are the things that God has already given you to do?
Yep.
It doesn't have to be things that you just love. It could be just the reality. Like, what has God given you
Right.
to do? I think when we really write it down, it helps us say, okay, what are the things that I've put on myself? And what are the things that God's really placed as an opportunity?
Yeah.
If you have a neighbor and there's opportunity and you're building a relationship with that person, maybe that doesn't mean that you need to go run way out there to try to find somebody else to have a relationship with. It might be
Mhm.
that this is the person that you've been given to have a relationship with, or maybe God's given you 10 young women at your church and
Yeah.
you are given an opportunity to disciple them. So I think writing down exactly all the opportunities and all the things that God's given you to do and to look for, I think the trick and the thing that's a really fun exercise is to take number 2 and number 3 and look at the intersection, right? The
Yeah.
intersection of where you're wired and how you're what your gives you like,
Get
I don't
excited
know.
about.
Yeah, what makes you excited and then look at what God's given you to do. Am I
Yeah.
missing anything? What is a number 4? Is there a number 4?
Probably pray. Like, just then, we
That
can
that
kind
might
of,
be a good idea, Eve.
I
That
mean,
might be
just
a good
like,
idea for us to pray. You're right.
like just looking
Yes.
through. But even when you look through and find intersection, you may still find that
Yeah.
there's more that you can actually do for this season. And so, like, just
Yes.
praying and asking the Lord to make your priorities really clear.
Yeah.
Like, Lord, help me choose the best thing right now. Thinking of like Mary
Yes.
and Martha, right? Like, he
Yes.
told, like, I'm not going to take away from her. She's chosen the best thing. And so,
Yes.
help me choose the best thing, Lord,
Yeah.
for what you've given me and how you've made me. What do I actually do with that?
It's good.
Okay. Well, I feel like we kind of already answered the next questions, which is like coming back to what is the gospel truth about this? How does knowing what we're called to do actually help us embrace our limitations?
Mm.
And why does it matter? So, when I think about it, there's that verse in Ephesians that talks about how we're his workmanship and
Mhm.
he's prepared good works for us to do. And so, the gospel is what actually secures our ability to do that. Like,
Yeah.
Jesus' death and resurrection make
Yes.
it so that we're able to be indwelt by his spirit to do the
Yes.
works that he's put out for us. And
Ephesians
so,
2, 8 through 10 is what you're referring to. And
yeah.
the whole premise there is that it's not because we have such great ideas of like our callings and we're
Mm,
just going to navigate our lives right, but that by grace we have been saved so that we can actually step into all the things he has for us to do. Call it calling, call it,
yeah.
the work he's prepared beforehand for us to engage in. But we can only do that when we're stepping into the redeemed life,
Yeah.
sanctified to be his workmanship.
Yeah. And it matters because those are unique to us, right? Like,
Hmm.
there's some things that are really unique. God makes us individuals wired differently.
Yes.
And we need to steward those individual gifts well, too, and those
We're not
callings.
all called to the same things. And so we just
Yeah.
can stop comparing and worrying about how somebody else
Yes.
is using their giftings. We're all different.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a good word. Yeah. We don't need to compare. Just write that down. Just jot that down in your journal too, guys.
I
That
know.
circle that, come back to it.
Yeah.
Okay, then one small thing besides doing steps 1 through 4.
Wow. Well, I mean, I really just was thinking through steps 1 through 4 on the fly here, but kind of like the last episode, I don't know that I concretely acknowledge how God is using me. I just
Mm,
walk around kind of like just putting out fires and trying to
yeah.
step into everything that he's given me to do. But I think this issue of calling is kind of almost like back to a mission statement of being
Mm,
like, you're not
yeah.
called to everything. We're just not. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't remember which episode I talked about this or if it's just on social media that I've shared about this, but the truth is we can be called to lots of different things, just not all at the same time. And
Yeah.
so no one person is called to everything all at the same time. And so it's really
Praise the
helpful
Lord.
to praise the Lord, right? The pressure's off. And so similarly in a mission statement, help like we'll know how to say yes to the right things if we can write down and concretely think through what has God given me to do? How has he wired me and given me opportunity to step into the ways in which he will be praised because of the way I use my giftings?
Yeah.
That's really the question, right? How has God wired me and what opportunities has he given me so that I can use my days in a way that honors and glorifies him? That's my calling and my mission right here, right now. And not that the big picture changes over time, but the way in which those opportunities play out will
Yeah.
change day by day, season after season. So
Yeah.
I'd like to revisit that myself, is to start with the small thing of like, Ruth, you're not called to everything. You're not
Hmm.
called to everybody. You don't have to
Yeah.
say yes to everything. And so what are you called to even in this season? Even if it looks really obvious by contracts and what I do online and
Right.
my job, that doesn't change the fact that I need to know personally what I'm
Yeah.
called to so that I know what I'm not called to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that for me, kind of the one small step to change or to apply this really is in that prayer piece. Like I said it
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, well, we should probably do that. And
Mm-hmm.
was kind of convicted as I said it, like, oh yeah, I probably should probably spend some more
Mm-hmm.
time just praying and saying like, Lord, I can pull, a list of all of these things that I think you've put before me and the ways that I would enjoy them, and it could be
Mm-hmm.
fun and they could be really good and godly things, but I still really need the Lord's help to discern
Yeah.
what the priorities are, because in my flesh I will still make everything a priority
Yep.
and it's not.
Yep.
So I think for me, spending some time in prayer.
Well, that's so good. And Eve, this has been a really good conversation for me personally. And I really
Yeah.
love this season. And I'm hoping all our listeners will continue to join us for the remaining episodes of this topic, because I think we all feel this. And sometimes it's just hard to acknowledge that
Yeah.
God's called us to specific things in specific seasons. And walking with him day by day, our everyday faithfulness absolutely matters. It's not that one big thing and one amazing thing
Mm,
we do for God. It's walking with him day by day, in step with him, as we discern how he is um, giving us opportunity and using our gifts all at the
yeah.
same time. So, friends, thank you so much for your continued support of the GraceLaced podcast. We hope that the episodes in this season are just the beginning of conversations you have with the people in your everyday life. If you share today's episode with a friend, you'll have a great reason to get together for coffee or a walk and discuss all the things that we've talked about. Are you ready? Set, go.